Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, What's New in Bank Board Governance. I'm Emily McCormick, the Vice President of Editorial and Research at Bank Director. I oversee our research initiatives and content for the Bank Services Program, in addition to contributing to Bank Director Magazine and bankdirector.com. Today, we'll discuss how bank boards are grappling with compensation and governance issues, including succession planning, risk oversight, and board composition. This will be based in part on our recent compensation and talent survey and our 2024 governance best practices survey, which we released about a week ago. You'll be able to find both surveys on bankdirector.com. Just click on research in the drop-down menu. Now, before we get into our discussion, let's go over just a few housekeeping items. First off, don't worry, we can't hear you. You've joined this webinar in listen-only mode. If you have a question for our panel today, just note them by clicking the Q&A button found on the right-hand side of your screen. And we encourage you to ask questions throughout the conversation today, so don't hesitate. There's no need to take detailed notes. The presentation will be shared with all attendees within 24 hours via email. You'll also be able to find this on bankdirector.com. If you have any technical issues, you can also note those using the Q&A button on the right-hand side of your screen. Our team will email you a solution using the email address that you registered with. So we'll do our best to take care of any problems you may have. And then finally, the opinions expressed in this webinar of those of the individual speakers only and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the other speakers or of the entities with which the speakers are associated. So with all that addressed, we're going to go ahead and jump into our discussion, but first let me introduce our panel. First off is Jack Milligan. Jack Milligan is Bank Director's Editor-at-Large and our governance guru. In addition to writing for our magazine, Jack has spent the past few years developing Bank Director's Director Certification Program, which includes a fundamental course geared for newer directors, as well as a new advanced program. And we're hosting another round of workshops in September and would love to see you in Nashville. And Dave Porteous is also steeped in governance experience due to his service on both community and regional bank boards. He's currently the lead independent director at Huntington Bankshares, where he's served since 2003. He chairs the Nominating and ESG Committee and Executive Committee and is a member of the Risk Oversight Committee, all experience that we're going to hear from today. So welcome, gentlemen.
Great to be here.
All right. Well, let's jump in. We're going to dig into some of the findings from our two most recent surveys, but I did want to start more broadly with this discussion today. And Dave, we're going to start with you, but I've got the same question for Jack. Dave, what do you believe are the biggest challenges facing bank boards today?
Well, Emily, it's certainly much different than it was when I began service on a community bank board 40 years ago. In those days and many years beyond that, credit was probably the thing that was most critical. It was the thing that we talked about in board meetings. It was what was sort of foundational for the bank. Not that credit isn't important, it will always be important, but it now is one of many. And so today, every board member, every bank, every executive should be thinking about how are we dealing with cyber? How are we dealing with technology? How are we competing with not just our peer banks or the other banks in our community, but how are we competing against fintechs and so many other organizations that are creeping into, some would say not creeping into, sort of the payment space. And then you add to that all of the political volatility that's going on around the world and in our country, and issues of climate and so many other issues. So the challenges are diverse, they're many, but it's what makes serving on a bank board, I think, so appealing and enriching, which is challenges that you can help solve.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a diverse array of issues, and we're going to talk, I think, about some of those specifically, as well as, how to strengthen the board. Jack, what would your response be to that question, the biggest challenges facing boards today?
Well, I think David hit all the really important ones. I think I would add the fact that banking is a very dynamic industry. You just look at what has happened for the past couple of years. We had the uh, COVID-19 pandemic. We had an extraordinary physical response from the U.S. government. We had a surplus of funds, so much so that banks weren't sure what to do with them, so they put them into some longer term so-called safe securities. Federal Reserve raises interest rates, and all of a sudden, banks have an interest rate risk management dilemma to work through. I mean, the business of banking is complex. It changes, and it hasn't gotten any easier in the last couple of years. So I think just simply staying on top of what's happening in the industry, what's happening with regulation, certainly technology and cyber, the way David mentioned, it's a big challenge.
Yeah. Well, let's dive a little deeper. One of the things we spent a lot of time exploring in the 2024 Governance Best Practices Survey was engagement. So, looking at engagement by the board as an entity, looking at the engagement of individual directors. And directors do rate themselves fairly highly across factors such as meeting the board's fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, reviewing policies, monitoring risk. Most of our respondents also indicate that they generally contribute to discussions and they rate themselves highly as collaborators. But I do want to dig a little past these results and maybe understand some of the signs of a highly engaged board. So, Jack, in your work with boards, what do you see? What's a marker of a highly engaged board?
Show up prepared, show up ready to do business. I mean, have you gone through the board book? Are you fully, have you digested the material and have a list of questions? Do you participate in discussions? I know through past governance surveys that we've done, Emily, one of the things that boards talk about, a problem that they sometimes surface is the silent director,
Hmm.
the director who never really engages, never really participates in meetings. And my perspective would be if that's all you're doing is basically sitting there like a bump on a log, then I'm not sure what useful purpose you serve on a board.
Yeah. Dave, how would you approach that question? Thinking about your role as a lead director, how are you fostering engagement in the boardroom and ensuring your board's engaged on all those discussions about all those issues that you've got to go through?
Well, Emily, it's not unique to bank boards. It really is a situation with all boards, whether it's for profit, not for profit. And that is, as you sit back and you assess the board and you look at the board in a very open, constructive way, do you in fact have the diversity of thought, maybe the diversity of geography, uh, and all the other components that make up diversity, so that when you're having discussions in the boardroom, you're getting that sort of broad based discussion and input. I think what can happen on any board, and that is if you're not constantly assessing and reassessing the skill set you have and the way in which board members contribute, that it can become easy for you to become complacent or sort of defer to certain people to be the experts, or sometimes over time, the boardroom discussions become dominated by an individual or a small subset of individuals as opposed to the breadth. So by example, as a lead director, part of my responsibility is not just as we're recruiting directors and as we're assessing directors annually as we do, but I have a responsibility at every meeting to make sure that I've talked to my board members ahead of time to see what's important to them, what needs to be discussed, that I share that with management. And then in the board discussions, shame on me if I don't go around the room at different times and bring out of my fellow board members some of their experiences and expertise. So I lay the responsibility on me as a board leader, on our individual directors, and oh, by the way, on the management of the bank. The bank needs to make sure that they are transparent, sharing the information, not managing the board, not managing the information that goes to the board, so that you have that sort of trusting, open relationship that's so key to engagement. Because one of the quickest ways that will shut down active engagement is not communicating very effectively.
Yeah, I'm glad you shined a light on some of that pre-work, Dave, that you're doing before, before you even get into the boardroom and as you're approaching the agenda. And I do want to follow up on board refreshment in just a few minutes and talk about board composition a little bit more deeply. But before we get to that, I did want to focus a little bit on the board's role in setting strategy. This is an area in our survey, in the governance best practices survey, where directors maybe rate their board a little lower. They still feel good about it, but they rate their board a little lower. And I know there's some contention about the role of management in strategic planning and then the role that the board plays in strategic planning. And Jack, this is something that you cover as part of our director certification program and the corporate governance workshop. So I hoped maybe you could kind of set the stage in terms of what's important for board members to understand about that responsibility in strategic planning.
Sure. And then Dave, and I should tell your audience that Dave and I are old friends, and I've had many, many, many conversations over the years with Dave on corporate governance, including how Huntington approaches strategic planning. So you're going to hear it from him in a minute or
Yeah.
two. But I think the biggest challenge, or a big challenge that boards have when it comes to strategic planning, is being an equal partner,
Mm.
which is really the expectation of the regulators, if not, in fact, they expect the board to set the tone, to set the strategic direction for the organization. Now, if you think of the composition of a typical bank board, let's say you have 10 people, and one of those directors is the CEO. So he or she is your banker. Maybe there's one other banker. Maybe there's somebody that came in through an acquisition a year or two before. But the rest of the board are really made up of, a collection of professions, a collection of experiences, but not a lot of expertise in banking. So, to really engage with management at a deep level on strategy can be a challenge for boards, and for directors who don't come from a banking background. And I think one of the ways that you can sort of address that issue is talk about strategy throughout the year, as a planned exercise. Because if you're only talking about strategy when it comes to the strategic plan, you're not really ready for it. You're not really practiced at having those kinds of conversations. So I think it can be helpful to have, um, you know, at board meetings, set aside some time for discussion about some type of strategic issue that is important to the bank. But again, you're expected to be an equal partner when it comes to setting strategy. That's the expectation that certainly the regulators have for you.
Yeah. Well, Dave, Jack set that up. How are you approaching that at Huntington?
Well, first of all, let me say amen to Jack's comments. And as I mentioned before, my father and grandfather were bankers, but they were bankers of a different generation. And there's no question that they set the strategy and the agenda for the bank. That would simply not work today. And let me share with you a little bit about the lessons, and some of them are hard lessons that we learned at Huntington, and that is the world of banking is very, very different today than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it is virtually impossible, in my humble opinion, for any leader or any sort of leaders of the bank to be able to, on their own, set strategy in the depth and the breadth that's required from a bank board and the bank itself. Why is that? Because the world is rapidly changing. So I think strategy begins not necessarily when you sit down and begin to talk about strategy. Strategy begins with the people that you recruit and your board and the makeup of the board. And then once you sort of work hard and get that right, if that's the right term for that, with the board, with the diversity of thought and experience, the constructive engagement, the life lessons that board members bring, then there has to be, as Jack pointed out, a sharing, a partnership between the leadership of the bank and the board regarding strategy. I think strategy is one of the hardest things, one of the most difficult things for a board and management to work on because, as we've talked about, things are changing rapidly. So, with the board and management, there has to be this transparency and openness regarding where are we as an institution? Do we have the technology that we need? Do we need to invest more in technology? Maybe we cut back a little bit on stock buybacks or dividends to have additional capital to invest the things that we have to do to remain strong and relevant in the communities that we serve. And then you need to not just, and I'm a big believer in sort of at least once a year having an in depth strategic planning session, and then periodically at board meetings discussing that, not just once a year, but constantly looking, challenging yourself, refreshing your strategic planning. And then, as part of the strategic planning, if you don't have maybe some of the current expertise that you need to have the effective challenge that you need to have in discussing it, then bring in somebody from the outside. Could be a third party consultant to help you sort of enhance the richness of the discussion. And I think this is critical as it relates to the technology. And by the way, I don't care what the size of the bank is, these challenges are sort of universal. And then once you sort of set down sort of on the strategy, you also have to understand, and sometimes these are the hardest discussions you have in the board meeting, and that is there's only so much capital to go around.
Mm-hmm.
You can never spend all the money that needs to be spent, for example, on technology and cyber and whatnot. So you really have to be a careful steward of your not taxpayers, but the capital of the organization to try to invest in a way that allows you to be competitive. And don't always jump at the sort of shiny penny, but make sure that there is that give or take in the discussion. And then once you've set the strategy, I can assure you, no matter how smart management is, no matter how smart the board is, the strategy that you set on will be subject to change. And sometimes it may be subject to change within a month or two. So you have got to be nimble. And God, that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
When you've set the strategy and you've communicated the strategy in the organization and off you go, the hardest thing to do is change or adjust that. But if you don't, you're likely at some point in time to go over the cliff.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things that you brought up, Dave, the need for broad ranging discussions while also being nimble and reacting kind of reminds me of something, Jack, that I've heard you say a good bit through our corporate governance workshop. And that's really around the need to look outside what's going on at the bank, looking maybe outside the markets of the bank, maybe looking even outside of the industry. I've heard you say that a lot. It's something I've taken to heart, but I hoped maybe you could explain why that's so important to look past just your institution and maybe just your markets.
Well,
Well,
banking is such a numbers oriented business that it's easy, I think, for boards to become a little myopic in the sense of really focusing inward on numbers and the performance of the bank, and that's really important. That's part of what you're there to do. But we live in a very dynamic world. Things can change very quickly, as David just said a moment ago. A couple of years ago, I was asked by a farm credit bank up in the upper Midwest do a presentation to the board about, how the board could become develop its own sense of strategic leadership. And part of what I said was, you really need to pay attention to what's happening in the world around you. This happened to be at a time when we were engaged with a trade war with China,
Hmm.
and wheat exports were in the bullseye. And my comment was, and it was probably obvious to most of them, but you can't be a farm credit bank in the upper Midwest and not be asking the question, what are these tariffs going to do to our customers and their competitiveness, and how will that impact us? I think a more recent example would be just the change in interest rates. It was well signaled by the Federal Reserve that it was going to start raising interest rates because of its concern about inflation. And certainly boards, I think at that point, should have been asking their management teams, how is this going to impact our balance sheet? Where could this hurt us? How should we react to this? So some of those things occur quickly. They're oftentimes driven by the economy, changes in the economy. They can be driven by political events. But some of these things are longer term. I have a story in the current issue about the rise of shadow banking.
Yes.
Shadow banks are huge now. They're a big, big, big competitive threat. They tend to focus on asset classes, which makes them very, very vigorous competitors in those asset classes. They tend to have excellent technology, and I think boards need to watch that and to reassess their own value proposition in the face of that kind of competition. So I think you always need to pay attention to what's happening around you in the world and how does it affect our enterprise.
Hmm. Yeah, if anybody out there, that is Jack Story from the latest issue of Bank Director magazine, and it really illustrates the changes to the financial sector. We can mortgage is a great example of how that business has shifted from the banking industry to largely shadow banks. Dave, what would you add to that?
Well, I think it points to sometimes one of the tougher things that boards have to do, which is, board. It's nice when you get together and everybody's happy and everything's going fine, and you sort of talk to each other about how wonderful everything is. But that is not life, and that is not realism. And
Hmm.
so, the challenge I lay out to all boards and all directors is that it's critically important that you have the uncomfortable discussions too. Now, that doesn't mean you have an argument. That doesn't mean that you're angry at all, but it means you have that constructive engagement where you really do challenge maybe your own beliefs. So, for example, you would not want a board all made up of Dave Porteous who lived through the financial meltdown of 2008. I don't know that I'd make a loan. Just like you need individuals who in technology, like my kids or my grandkids. And why is that? It is because, as we've talked about, things are changing pretty rapidly. So if you have this diversity of experience and expertise, bring in individuals who may have what your board doesn't, and then have that really honest exchange about number one, as a bank, what are our values? What are we going to serve? How are we going to do that? And recognize that we can't be things to all people. And so you have to have those hard discussions. And sometimes your customers push you in that way. They want this, they want that. And you have to be in a position to say, this is what we stand for, and this is how we're going to deliver that product or that service, and recognize that there may be some areas you just do not do, or cannot do, or should not do.
Well, bringing up diverse viewpoints, that is actually in the survey, we asked a question, really fascinating question about identifying deficiencies in board culture. And most of our respondents found something, but one, and it's really all over the map. That's why it's kind of a fascinating question, because there's not necessarily weakness found in bank boardrooms that's as unique as institutions seem to be themselves. But one of the bigger deficiencies identified was a lack of diverse viewpoints. And we have a ton of stats in our survey that really kind of look at board refreshment and backgrounds and skills in the boardroom. And I want to dig into board refreshment, board composition a little bit more deeply. But to start that off, we actually got a question in. So I want to make sure we're addressing our questions from the audience. And this one is basically, what part should bank management play in director recruitment, identifying candidates, and vetting candidates? So Dave, we'll start with you. I mean, does management play a role there, or does the board entirely own that board refreshment process?
The answer, in my opinion, should be there should be a collaboration. If there's not, you're missing a great opportunity. Let me share with you how we do it at Huntington. Doesn't mean that's how everybody should do it. First of all, every year we sit down and do an assessment, individual, directors, and collectively. And part of that is identifying what are the skill sets that we have, what are the skill sets that we need for the future. And sometimes you find you have directors who are really very good, but maybe their skill sets are not what's going to be needed in the future. And so if you first and foremost have to frankly decide what are the skills that you have, what are you going to need in the future, and then think about, do we need to make some changes right away? Can we wait maybe till there's some retirement? And so there's different ways to look at it. But what is important is that you identify the skill sets in the future. Maybe it's cyber, maybe it's digital, maybe it's legal, maybe it's any number of different things. And once the board, in conjunction with the leadership of the bank, what those skill sets are and when they're needed, then at that point in time, at least what we do is Steve Steiner, our CEO, myself, as chairman of the nominating ESG committee, we ask our board members. They're one of the greatest tools for identifying and recruiting great board members. Do you know anybody? Are you familiar with anybody? In most cases, we get some great referrals. In addition, we sometimes will utilize, if we're not able to locate maybe the expertise we need or get to the diversity we need, we may use a recruiting service to help us in that regard. And then in that process, as sort of the chairman of the nominating, I sort of lead that search, but Steve Steiner, our CEO, and I are very closely aligned with that. And then we may bring one or two or three individuals to the NOM committee and ESG committee, and then make a recommendation to the board. But it is a very engaged process involving management, involving the board, and ultimately we want a consensus regarding the person that's selected.
Mm-hmm. Jack, what are some best practices you have found in terms of getting the composition that the board needs?
Well, I'll just build on something that Dave said a moment ago about Huntington annually sort of doing its own board assessment from a skills and experience perspective. And does the board have the expertise of the things it needs for the challenges that it's facing or challenges it may face in the future? And I've paid a lot of attention to the Huntington board over the years, and the change in composition, the refreshment strategy that's gone on there is really quite impressive. This is a board it's not static in the sense of not adapting to the challenges ahead. I think it's really key that your board reflect both your communities and your customer groups. I saw a statistic recently that 42% of all U.S. businesses are owned by women. And many of those women will be your customers. And if you have a board of 9 people, 10 people, and you have only one female, or maybe no females on the board, then I think you're missing an opportunity to get their insight into what the challenges of being a female business owner are, and how the bank can be supportive in that. And I mean, if you're a privately held company and you're planning on going public at some point in the future, and you don't have anybody on your board who's ever been the director of a public company, I think you would do well to go out and find somebody who understands what some of those challenges are, particularly in terms around SEC reporting. It can be
Mm.
around dealing with institutional investors, a very different kind of shareholder base with different expectations. If you're a bank that's never done an acquisition and you're thinking, well, we need to grow, and I think we're going to do some M&A, and there's nobody on the board who's ever done an M&A deal, I think you sure as heck should find somebody who could come in. You'll have advisors that you'll work with, financial and legal advisors, of course, but I think it would be well to have somebody on the board who has that experience, can be a source of strength for the rest of the board. So, I think you need to pay attention to the demographics of your customer base and your communities, and you have to look at where are we going strategically, and do we have, as Dave said, a composition that supports that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we see that through, I think, more and more boards adding technology expertise as well. That they're looking at where those initiatives are going, and are we asking the right questions? Thinking on the other side of the refreshment process, maybe you've added a new board member or two. I think that leads us to talk about director onboarding. And we have a question in the 2024 Governance Best Practices Survey asking about director onboarding practices and what banks are doing. So if that's something you're curious about in the audience, I would definitely go check that out. So I'm curious, Dave, as you're thinking about the onboarding process, what has been most effective? What have you found to be most effective at Huntington in terms of getting those board members in, getting them up to speed? Because it takes a while to, be effective on a bank board and kind of understand and get your bearings on what's going on.
Well, thanks for that question, Emily. And let me say that in that area, I'm a work in progress. When I became the lead director at Huntington Bank 12, 13 years ago, or however many years ago it was, I don't think, as I look back on it, I was not as good in that area as I needed to be. And so what did we learn, sort of bring us up to now, is we began to engage the individual, the person coming on our board, with both sort of an in-person visit on the onboarding process, along with a written one, and then also the leadership members. Because one of the things that we learned a lot from talking to the person we brought on the board, and by the way, we do that shortly after they're on the board, but we do it a year later. And what we found out? There's a lot of things that would have helped them in the early days if we would have provided part of that as part of the onboarding and educational process. In addition, some of the things, and I'll just say myself, that I thought were maybe more important than others, our leadership team provided input that was far more robust and far more helpful. So our process today is much better than it was. But let me also point out, we consider onboarding and board education to be a never-ending opportunity for us. We provide for our board members examples of, like, Bank Director magazine and the activities that you have. Most CPA firms, law firms, universities have lots of programs. We pull that together, provide it to our board members, and then we cover that expense for the board member to attend those. And so again, it begins with orientation and onboarding, but we think that's a never-ending process. And I think if you ask me about it a year or 2 years from now, we will be better than we are today.
Well, I have to admit, when I put together that question for the governance survey, Jack, I pulled from something that you wrote for our bank services program, which was a director onboarding guide. So, much thanks to your work on that, because that really allowed us to assess what boards are doing now. But I am curious, through that, and through your work with boards, have you seen some common gaps in director onboarding?
I think the biggest gap is the lack of a plan.
Hmm.
Dave told me that years ago. I won't say how many years ago, but when he joined a bank board as a young corporate attorney, he went to the meeting, he sat, he listened. Who knows how much he understood of what was going on? And the meeting was over, and he got up and he left. And that was basically his onboarding experience. Now, Dave will enhance or modify that story if I don't have it quite right. But I think the biggest shortcoming is not having a plan. And if you don't do board refreshment very much, if you haven't brought in a new director in 5, 6, 7 years, then you're probably not practiced at this process. And really, it's just a matter of sitting down and thinking comprehensively, what do we need to do to really integrate this new director into our process, get them to understand the bank strategy, get them to understand the senior management team. I know that at Huntington, new directors, they all spend time with members of senior management. I mean,
Hmm.
they get to know them. And it's a way of getting to know the bank in addition to getting to know the individual. So I think the most important thing is to have a plan, even if it's not a perfect plan. It will accelerate their learning curve, and frankly, that's one of the reasons why we decided to start a certification program, because we really felt that this was not something that the industry does well in terms of new director onboarding, and we're just trying to accelerate the learning curve.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Um,
Emily, let me just add to
yeah.
Jack. It's another example of saying amen so many times to what Jack has to say. And that is, I think sometimes we just assume that the people coming on the board know and understand whatever it is that we're going to be talking about at board meetings. The reality is, if you have a diverse board, you're going to have a number of folks that may not be very familiar with the balance sheet at all. I mean, what are the key facts out of the financials and your balance sheet that every board member, even if they're not an expert, need to know every meeting? Is it your return on assets or ROE? Is it your efficiency ratio? What are the things that are tried and true measurements
Hmm.
over the years that everybody needs? And then it's the responsibility of the organization and the board to make sure that you're continually providing that experience and expertise.
Well, I'm glad we've been able to dive into this. We've actually, before we segue to the next topic, we've had a couple of audience questions come in. So obviously, a lot of interest in this topic. Uh, the first question is for both of you. What are your views on committee rotations, committee chair rotations, and then separately term limits for the board? Any thoughts on those?
You can start, Jack. I'll be happy to add.
Um, well, I'm probably have a better answer on term limits than I do on committee the chair rotations. I think that can be. I think I see a benefit in it in the
Hmm.
sense that if you have been chair of the audit committee for 10 years, um, or have things become pro forma for you in terms of what you look at, the questions that you ask. So if you are doing a rotation periodically, um, you come in as the new audit chair, having been the comp committee chair for maybe 5 or 6 years previously, and certainly would have participated in discussions about audit related issues and risk related issues. It probably can be helpful, fresh set of eyes, a fresh perspective. The challenge I see is that these are complex, especially audit and
Hmm.
compensation, and particularly compensation if you're a public company. I mean, these are really complex issues, and it's you have someone in there who's really good at it. They've been doing it for a while, and they really understand it. I can imagine it's tough to think about swapping them out and starting over with somebody else. So that's my thought on committee chairs. In terms of term limits, I personally would think it would be a good idea. Part of the challenge in board refreshment is that oftentimes directors don't want to leave the board. They're enjoying the experience.
Mhm.
And there's some prestige attached to it. Bank directors generally don't make a lot of money, certainly at the community bank level, so it's probably not really about the compensation, but it is an enjoyable experience for a lot of people. But sometimes you have directors who've been on the board for a long time and they're enjoying it, but they're not really contributing the way they used to. And what's really necessary, I think, in those situations is someone like a Dave Porteous having an honest conversation about, whether it's time perhaps for them to give up their board seat to someone else who comes in with a different perspective that maybe is more suited to where the bank is going strategically. And term limits can be a way of, it can be a way of keeping people from getting too comfortable.
Mm.
Uh, but not everybody likes them. So some people wouldn't want to be put in a situation where their tenure would be voted upon by shareholders. So it can be maybe a cultural hurdle for some boards. But I'll
Do
flip it
either
over to you.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I'm curious. Do either of you see the peer evaluation process where each director is evaluated, and that probably involves a one-on-one conversation with the lead director or board chair? Is that a good alternative to term limits in that you've got a path for to ensure that this individual is still the right person for the board? Dave, do you use peer evaluations, or do you? Uh, okay, we may have lost Dave here,
So,
so we'll give Dave a minute. Oh, there we go. We got Dave back.
okay. I didn't know you lost me, but all right. Okay. So anyway, first of all, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this, but I do have a strong opinion as it relates to it. And it comes from sort of years of service on boards, different boards, and doing governance programs for the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, bank director, like we're doing today, and otherwise. And that is generally you utilize prescriptive requirements like term limits, age
Retirement.
requirements, because that's easier
Mm,
than dealing with what many people view as the more difficult discussion of self assessments. Now, my debate or argument is that if you have a board that engages in constructive engagement and discussion all the time, sitting down annually and talking about sort of where we are, how we're doing, what we need in the future. It's not necessarily, well, how do I grade the person next to me? I actually think that can be a bit destructive. But I think if you have the conversation, maybe it's with the chairman of the board or the lead director or whatever, with people individually and then collectively, what you end up doing is having a consensus. You know what? We need to recruit somebody. We're going to need somebody to rotate off. And what you find out is if you have the open, honest, candid, transparent discussions, it goes pretty smoothly. Now, occasionally it doesn't. Occasionally, but very exceptional, where you have to sit down with somebody and say, I really need your spot. They're not happy about it. But that really is the exception if you have this sort of collaborative approach. And as I often say to folks, if you had term limits, you may, depending on what they are, and by the way, in Europe, they do have term limits. after 10 or 11 years, you're no longer considered independent and they want you off the board. I think that's unfortunate. Like I said earlier, I wouldn't want everybody on the bank board that lived through 2008 and 9 because their view on banking may not be as open as it needs to be. On the other hand, the value of having one or two people on your board that went through that crisis, that learned those lessons, sharing those, just like having somebody who's brand new, who is dealing in the digital age, doesn't go into branch banks at all, provide some of that important perspective. I just think again is important. So I am not a big fan of prescriptive age requirements, you know, term limits, but I understand where organizations that may be the only way they solve their refreshment issue.
Mm. Another question that we had in line with this was around the use of advisory boards to identify board members. And I know we hear through our research a lot of, especially mutual banks, will use their corporator base. My understanding is that I feel like my sense is that fewer banks are using advisory boards, but do either of you really see that as a path to board refreshment or something that's commonly used these days?
So the answer is I think it can be. I might point out I began my career on an advisory Huntington board, and then 18 years ago or 19 years ago, went on the board of the holding company. I've also served on one other chemical bank, which was headquartered in Midland, Michigan. I sat on one of their advisory boards. So I've sat on a couple of bank advisory boards, as well as bank holding company boards of different sizes. And my view is this, and by the way, at Huntington, we do have some advisory boards throughout our footprint. The advisory board works if the person in that community or that region and the individuals on that advisory board bring value to the discussions. And that value is not, by the way, having lunch once a month or once a quarter and sort of chit chatting. It is about actively engaging with the leadership in the region or where the advisory board represents and being able to say to management, here are the opportunities, here are some of the challenges, here are the things we're doing really well, here are maybe the opportunity to enhance that. In other words, all of us are busy. Most of us don't want to sit on an advisory board if we're not bringing value. So it's incumbent upon the advisory board and the management of the bank to make sure it's providing value. If it's not, then I don't think they serve the purpose that they could.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know some banks, for example, still have separate boards for their holding company and the insured depository institution, and we'll sometimes think of that as like a AAA farm team, that lower board, and the same with advisory boards. It can be a way of getting to know someone in a board like context, and see how they would fit, what they're like to work with, what the chemistry is like with them, how they are with other people. I can see that being valuable, but I would certainly agree with Dave that if that's not the main reason why you could have an advisory board,
Yeah.
so it could be a farm team for your holding company board. That board has to provide, that advisory board has to provide real value. And if somebody comes out of it who ends up on a holding company board because you got to know them, that to me is an added benefit, but it's not the raison d'etre.
Yeah. Well, we've got a little over 10 minutes left. We're going to shift gears. I do want to focus on one of the board's biggest responsibilities, which is succession planning. But if you're watching this webinar, if you've got more questions, feel free to go ahead and submit those, and we'll try to address what we can during our remaining time. But did want to talk about succession planning. It's a big focus of our compensation and talent survey this year. And Dave, I wanted to start out by drawing from your experience. You've mentioned your CEO, Steven Steinauer. He's served since 2009, I believe, and you were part of that process as lead director. So I hoped maybe you could walk us through how your board approached that process and maybe even share how your focusing on succession planning as a process. I'm not trying to put anything out there for Stephen Steinhauer's career path, but how you're focusing on that as a board now. Whether that's a constant conversation that's happening for you right now.
Well, thanks, Emily. In some respects, that process is still relevant. And what do I mean by that? It was 2008. It
Mm,
looked like the economy was going over the cliff. If you were in the banking industry, you really didn't know from day to day what the world might look like. And at Huntington, as we looked at the future, in conjunction with the CEO that we had at the time, we knew that it was good that we had to decide as an organization, were we going to consider selling the bank? Were we going to consider staying independent? What were the options in front of us as we looked at the future? And probably as a good lawyer, people could argue those different alternatives very forcefully. What did we do? We sat down as a board. We brought in an independent third party to talk with us about, as a board, with our responsibility to shareholders, colleagues, the communities that we serve, what was the future of the bank? And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't drink the Kool-Aid, but challenged ourselves. What was so important about that is we came out of that process, and the board was unanimous that said the hardest thing is to remain independent. In 2009, we wanted to remain independent. We thought that was what was best for all of our various stakeholders. So then we said, okay, we're going to stay independent. Now, what's the leadership that we need for the future? And so we arrived at what was going to be needed. And we went out, and in our case, we did a national search that ended up with Steve Steinhauer. And we've been very fortunate. Steve's been an exceptional CEO by any measure, has now been there 15 years, has transformed us as an organization. But that doesn't mean that as a bank, you don't have plans in place. What happens sort of if Steve Steinhauer was hit crossing the street tomorrow? How are you going to handle that? What are you doing as an organization, not just with the CEO, but at the executive leadership
mm,
team as it relates to succession management? And as a board, we focus on Steve, but we focus on all of his direct reports too. So we know exactly sort of how they're doing, what opportunities we're giving to them to enhance their skills as members of the leadership team, and provide opportunities for individuals within the organization to build the skill sets and potentially have the opportunity at the point in time that Steve says, I'm ready now for a transition. In addition, we're acutely aware of the world and the changing world, and sometimes individuals that you may be providing these opportunities to enhance your skill sets, or you're thinking about CEO or executive leadership, that changes
mm,
based on the world. I would say 10 or 20 years ago, understanding cyber, digital, IT wasn't near as important as it is today. So that's, and then at Huntington, every year we do an evaluation of our CEO. That evaluation is done. He does a self evaluation. He does goals for the next year. He assesses himself based on his goals that he had set for that year. And then I talk to each board member about that, share it with them, talk with each board member about it. And then we sit down with Steve and go over sort of his self evaluation, our evaluation, and then his goals for the upcoming year. And that sort of collaboration has worked really well for us.
mm. Jack, I wanted to get your point of view on this too, because succession planning is kind of a once in a lifetime event for a lot of directors. It's probably, something they'll go through maybe once. But Dave also brings up some great points about CEO evaluations. I'm curious what you see. as maybe some aspects of the succession planning process, or even CEO evaluation that you believe are underappreciated by boards?
Oh yeah, I'm surprised. I've we've surfaced this in past governance surveys. I'm surprised at
Mhm.
how few banks actually evaluate the performance of their CEO on an annual basis. That's shocking to me, and that may be certainly more prevalent at smaller banks, privately held, where the CEO can be a pretty powerful individual, um, and other directors may be somewhat reluctant to go down the assessment path with that person. But yeah, I think I think everybody. I'm a big believer in the assessment process. I think everybody needs to be assessed. Their performance needs to be assessed, whether they're a director who's been on the board for 15 years or whether they're a CEO. I think with CEO succession, what a lot of boards miss is exactly how long a thoughtful process can take. I think it can easily take 3 years if you're really going to try to identify a group of individuals, internal candidates, and do an assessment of them, and then make a decision about, so how do we train these people up so that when it's time for a transition, they're ready. Or if we decide that we don't have an internal candidate who really rings the bell for us, then if we're going to go outside and
Mm,
recruit somebody from another bank, from another organization, you don't want to rush that process. You want it to be thoughtful. You want it to take the time that it takes. So, I think if you imagine a scenario where the CEO comes to the board and says, I'd like to retire in a year, and there's never really been a lot of discussion about succession and how
mhm.
that process can be handled and who the candidates might be, I think that puts the board in a really awkward position. One of the things and I'll just add this, I think one of the things you need in that scenario is a CEO who doesn't drive the process, but is a partner in that process.
Yeah.
And someone who's willing to commit to leaving at a certain point in time, far enough in advance that the board actually has time to be thoughtful about succession. And that's not easy for every CEO because it sort of is you put a marker on yourself now. Your honor and your prestige has an expire by date, which is not, we all have egos. And that's just not necessarily an easy thing for most people. But I think two things. I think you need to give it enough time, number one, and then you need a CEO who can be a partner in that process, mentor internal candidates if you've got them, be willing to commit to a departure date far enough in advance so that whether you have an internal candidate or you go outside, the board has enough time to do that in a thoughtful way.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an important topic. It's the cover of the recent issue of Bank Director Magazine, where you'll also find Jack's shadow banking article. I mean, one of the things that really struck me is you do need that, or ideally have that collaboration with the CEO, but it's really behooves the board to put that work in and really understand who these candidates are and make sure that they feel good about that decision rather than relying entirely on the outgoing CEO's input. So yeah, definitely an important responsibility. And unfortunately, we're running low on time. So, which I expected. I wanted to ask the two of you as we wrap this up. Just kind of a quick answer to this. I would like to hear from each of you as we close. What's the number one characteristic required in bank boardrooms today? So, Dave.
Well, if you're going to make it one word or one character, I would say it's integrity. But I could pick a lot of other things. But to me, integrity is the foundation that almost everything else comes from.
All right, Jack.
I think Dave and I both agree that integrity is table stakes for board service. If you're not an honest person, you don't belong at a bank board. But I'm going to say engagement. If
Yeah.
you've got a group of committed directors who are all engaged and they want the same thing, which is for the organization to be successful, I think you go a long way toward having a high performing board and a board that's a terrific resource to the senior management team.
Yeah. Well, Dave, Jack, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. To everyone out there, thank you for attending the webinar today. As a reminder, you will receive an email that will allow you to revisit or share this broadcast. And if you're interested in our surveys or research reports, you will find that in the research section at bankdirector.com. If you've got any questions about our research, please reach out to me. You can reach me at emccormick@bankdirector.com. And if you have any questions about Bank Director's Director Certification Program, also reach out to me via email and I'll put you in touch with the right person there. But for now, we're going to sign off. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.